September 3, 1939, the Atlantic Ocean. A British passenger liner disappears beneath the surface without warning. No warning shots, no survivors pulled from the water in time. Just an explosion, a list to one side, and thousands of tons of steel sliding quietly into darkness. There is no battlefield, no front line, no cheering crowd. And yet, at that moment, the war for Europe's survival has already begun. If this ocean is lost, everything else becomes irrelevant. No tanks reach the front, no food reaches the cities, no fuel reaches the airfields. Britain does not fall to invasion. It starves. The Battle of the Atlantic is not announced. There is no single day when it begins and no clear moment when it ends. It stretches across years, weather, and thousands of miles of open water where death arrives without witnesses. Most of the men who fight it never see the enemy. Many never even know what killed them. And that is exactly why it works. Germany understands the equation early. Britain is an island that cannot feed itself. Cut the shipping lanes, and time will do the rest. No decisive naval battle is required. Just pressure, just attrition. Just enough sinkings, week after week, until imports fall below survival level. The weapon chosen for this task is the submarine. Not glamorous, not loud, not heroic in the traditional sense. A steel tube packed with men, diesel fumes, and torpedoes, slipping unseen beneath the surface. U-boats do not need to win battles. They only need to make the ocean dangerous enough that ships stop coming. In the first months of the war, they do exactly that. Merchant vessels sail alone, unescorted, carrying food, coal, ammunition, civilians' lives stacked invisibly in their holds. When a torpedo hits, there is rarely time. The ship breaks. Water floods compartments faster than men can react. Lifeboats freeze in the North Atlantic or drift for days without being found. Sometimes rescue comes. Often it doesn't. There is no enemy to shoot back at, no target to charge, just the knowledge that somewhere below something is watching, calculating, waiting for the moment when escape becomes impossible. By 1941, the numbers are brutal. Hundreds of ships lost, millions of tons sunk. Britain's reserves shrink toward a point where rationing becomes desperation. Winston Churchill later admits that this is the only campaign that truly frightens him. Not the Luftwaffe, not the U-boats themselves, but the math. If sinkings continue at this rate, the war is lost without a single German soldier setting foot on British soil. The Allies respond the only way they can, not with brilliance, but with endurance. Convoys are formed, slow, vulnerable merchant ships clustered together under thin protection. Destroyers and corvettes circle constantly, sonar pinging into the depths, searching for echoes that might mean death. Crews live with permanent exhaustion, watches blur into each other. Every contact could be a whale, debris, or a submarine lining up a shot. Most contacts are false. The real ones are not. When a U-boat is detected, there is no duel. There is no honor. The escorts drop depth charges and hope. Explosions shake the water, pressure crushing anything nearby. Sometimes oil rises to the surface, accompanied by wreckage and bodies. Sometimes nothing happens at all, and the submarine slips away to strike again days later. The men inside those submarines live in a different hell. Heat, darkness, air thick with carbon dioxide, weeks without sunlight. Every patrol is a gamble between boredom and instant death. They listen for propellers, for sonar, for the moment when the ocean itself turns against them. This is not a war of glory. It is a war of logistics. Every ship that reaches port keeps a factory running. Every ship that sinks moves the clock closer to collapse. As the United States enters the war, the Atlantic expands. More ships, more targets, more deaths. German U-boats roam farther, even along the American coast, where cities still glow at night, silhouetting merchant vessels like targets in a shooting gallery. Sinkings spike again. Crews die within sight of land. And still, the ocean keeps swallowing evidence. The turning point does not come from a single invention or a single battle. It comes from accumulation, better radar, better sonar. Longer-range aircraft closing the air gap where submarines once hunted freely. New escort tactics, cracked codes, relentless pressure that forces U-boats to spend more time hiding than attacking. Slowly, the balance shifts. By 1943, the Atlantic begins to favor the Allies, not suddenly, but decisively. Sinkings drop. Submarine losses rise. Crews that once hunted now flee. The ocean that protected them becomes a trap they cannot escape. But even then, the battle never truly stops. Ships continue to sink until the last days of the war. Men continue to die alone, unseen, far from headlines and victory speeches. Supplies keep moving because they must. There is no alternative. When the war in Europe finally ends, the Atlantic does not look different. No ruins, no monuments, just water. And that is the point. The Battle of the Atlantic is invisible precisely because it succeeds, because ships arrive, because armies fight elsewhere, because cities live long enough to be liberated. Had it failed, there would have been nothing left to liberate. No Normandy, no liberation of Europe, no second chances. Just an ocean that did its work quietly and decided the fate of a continent without ever being seen. The danger with the Atlantic is that it never announces when it is winning. There is no single convoy whose survival guarantees success. No decisive engagement where one side clearly breaks the other. Instead, the balance is measured in spreadsheets, in tonnage charts, in numbers that creep upward or downward while men continue to drown in the dark. For long stretches of the war, Germany believes it is close. Sinkings spike. Shipping losses exceed construction. British stockpiles dip into margins that leave no room for error. A bad winter, a few more successful patrols. A breakdown in escort coverage. Any of it could tip the scale. And the men at sea feel it before anyone on land does. Convoy sailors learn to sleep in short bursts, fully clothed, boots beside their bunks. Alarms come without warning. 1 second the deck is calm, the next it is torn open, flames racing along spilled fuel, screams swallowed by wind and engines. There is no time to understand what is happening, only to react or not. In the water, survival becomes arithmetic. Temperature, distance, time, most never beat it. Escorts do not stop to pick up survivors if submarines might still be nearby. That decision is not cruelty, it is survival logic. Stop, and the convoy becomes stationary. Stationary means dead. The ocean teaches that lesson quickly and without mercy. On the other side, U-boat crews face their own attrition. Early confidence gives way to unease. Patrols grow longer, returns become rarer. Messages from headquarters promise success that does not match reality. Submarines vanish between ports, their loss explained away until it cannot be. Inside the boats, the pressure is constant. Depth charge attacks last hours. Lights flicker, hulls groan. Men count explosions and try not to imagine which one will be the last. When silence returns, it is never relief, only the knowledge that it can begin again at any moment. By 1942, the Atlantic has become a machine that consumes experience faster than either side can replace it. Veteran sailors die. New crews take their place with less training, less instinct, less margin for error. Mistakes multiply. Survival becomes less about skill and more about probability. This is where the Allies begin to gain something Germany cannot match. Time. Shipyards in North America turn steel into hulls faster than submarines can sink them. Losses hurt, but replacements arrive. Convoys that once sailed thin now grow dense. Escort coverage thickens. Aircraft appear overhead where none existed before. The ocean grows smaller. For U-boats, the air gap closes. The surface becomes dangerous. Diving becomes routine. Attacks become rushed. Success rates fall. Loss rates rise. Crews realize something has shifted before command admits it. The Atlantic is no longer a hunting ground. It is a gauntlet. And still, the war continues this way, not because either side believes in victory at sea, but because neither can afford to stop. Every ton that moves matters. Every ship lost matters. The math never stops. That is what makes the Battle of the Atlantic different from every other campaign. It does not reward boldness. It does not punish hesitation. It punishes interruption. As long as ships keep moving, Europe can keep fighting. If they stop, everything collapses behind them. So the convoys sail, the escorts circle, the submarines hunt, then hide, then die. And the ocean remains indifferent, swallowing evidence, erasing drama, deciding outcomes without ever allowing itself to be photographed. The war on land will eventually end. The war at sea will simply fade, not with a victory parade, but with the quiet realization that the numbers have finally moved far enough in one direction that starvation is no longer inevitable. That is how the Atlantic is won, not by conquest, by endurance. By the middle of the war, the Atlantic has reshaped everyone involved. For the men who sail it, time no longer feels linear. Weeks at sea blur together into a cycle of tension and exhaustion. The horizon never changes. The threat never leaves. Even when nothing happens, the waiting itself becomes a form of pressure. Every creak of the hull, every change in engine tone, every shadow on the water carries meaning that has to be evaluated instantly. Fear doesn't arrive as panic. It settles in as routine. Crews learn to function with it the same way they function with cold or hunger. They joke less. They talk in shorter sentences. They stop asking how long the voyage will take. That question has no useful answer. On merchant ships, survival depends on discipline more than courage. Staying at stations, following blackout rules, keeping formation even when instinct says to scatter. A lone ship is a dead ship, no matter how fast it runs. Safety exists only inside the group, and even there it is conditional. On escort vessels, the strain is different. They carry responsibility without control. They are expected to protect dozens of ships at once, knowing they cannot be everywhere. When a torpedo hits, they feel it as failure, even when nothing could have been done. They circle wreckage they cannot stop to rescue. They log coordinates. They move on. Those decisions leave marks that never fully fade. For U-boat crews, the ocean becomes claustrophobic. Early patrols promised initiative and surprise. Later ones promise only survival. The boats spend more time submerged, batteries draining, air growing foul. Attacks become rare and dangerous. Detection comes faster. Escape comes slower. Losses climb. Submarines vanish on patrol with no signal, no debris, no explanation. Ports receive fewer returning boats. Faces disappear from mess halls. Confidence gives way to resignation. The ocean that once offered invisibility now feels crowded, watched, hostile. This shift is not sudden enough to feel like defeat. It feels like attrition. By 1943, German commanders face a problem they cannot solve with bravery or innovation alone. Every new submarine takes time to build and crews to train. Every loss removes experience that cannot be replaced quickly. Meanwhile, Allied escorts improve with every voyage. Tactics are refined. Coordination tightens. Mistakes are analyzed instead of buried. The imbalance grows quietly. And yet, the Battle of the Atlantic never allows a sense of victory. Even when the numbers turn, ships continue to sink. Men continue to die without witnesses. The ocean never signals that the worst is over. It simply becomes less lethal, one convoy at a time. That uncertainty keeps everyone moving. Factories run without pause. Shipyards work around the clock. Sailors rotate in and out of danger without ceremony. The war machine depends on the assumption that the sea lanes will hold. Not perfectly, but enough. Enough food. Enough fuel. Enough time. Because that is what the Atlantic ultimately controls. Time. Time for armies to train. Time for aircraft to be built. Time for invasions to be planned and executed. Every convoy that arrives intact stretches that timeline forward. Every convoy lost compresses it. The margin is never comfortable. It is never secure. It exists only because men keep sailing into a space where survival is never guaranteed. The Battle of the Atlantic is fought without banners and without closure. It does not end with surrender or celebration. It ends when the flow becomes unstoppable, when the ocean can no longer interrupt the movement of war. And by the time that happens, the land battles everyone remembers are already in motion, supplied by ships that crossed an ocean where most of the fighting left no trace at all. What makes the Atlantic so different from every other front is that it never offers relief. There is no rotation away from danger that feels safe. Even ports are temporary. Ships unload, refuel, take on new cargo, and leave again, sometimes within hours. The sea does not care how long you have survived. It does not reward experience. It does not respect patterns. It only waits. For Britain, this waiting is existential. Every cabinet meeting returns to the same numbers: imports versus losses, calories versus population, fuel versus industry. The margin is always thin enough that one bad month could undo years of resistance. This is why the Atlantic frightens leaders more than bombs or armies. Bombs destroy buildings. Armies take ground. The Atlantic erodes everything quietly. And because it erodes quietly, it is easy to misunderstand. On land, failure is visible. A city falls. A front collapses. At sea, failure looks like delay, like empty warehouses, like factories slowing without explanation, like rations tightening one notch at a time until normal life becomes unrecognizable. That is the kind of defeat the Atlantic threatens. The Allies never fully relax, even after the balance shifts in their favor. They know how fragile the system is, how dependent it remains on weather, coordination, luck. One breakthrough in submarine tactics, one failure in escort coverage, one disruption in production. The math could tilt back again, so the pressure never lifts. Convoys grow larger, but also slower. Protection improves, but never becomes absolute. New technologies promise safety, then reveal new vulnerabilities. The war at sea is a constant adaptation loop where advantage never stays owned for long. Men sense this instability even if they cannot articulate it. They keep their gear close, they keep their expectations low. They treat survival as temporary. By the time Allied armies land in Normandy, the Atlantic has already decided something critical: that the invasion can be supplied, that losses, however severe, can be absorbed, that ships will keep coming tomorrow and the day after and the day after that. Without that certainty, the invasion never happens, not because it couldn't succeed tactically, but because it could not be sustained. Armies do not fight on courage alone. They fight on food, fuel, ammunition, and replacement men. All of that crosses water first. The Atlantic delivers it. And still, the cost continues. Long after the worst years pass, ships keep sinking. U-boats still find targets. Mines still detonate. Storms still scatter convoys. The ocean never stops taking payment. It only reduces the rate. This is why the Battle of the Atlantic does not have a clean narrative arc. There is no single turning point everyone agrees on. There is no day where victory becomes obvious. Instead, there is a gradual realization that starvation is no longer imminent, that the clock is no longer running out, faster than it can be extended. That realization comes quietly, in steadier rations, in fuller docks, in planning horizons that stretch months instead of weeks. By then, millions of tons of shipping lie on the seabed. Tens of thousands of men lie with them. Most have no graves, no markers, no witnesses beyond the water itself. And yet the war moves forward, because the Atlantic holds. What makes that endurance hard to appreciate is that it never announces itself. There is no signal flare that says the worst is past. No communique declaring the sea lanes secure. The men sailing in 1944 feel little difference from those who sailed in 1941. The ocean still kills without warning. Ships still vanish between ports. Storms still scatter convoys until escorts lose contact and panic sets in again. The Atlantic never becomes safe. It only becomes survivable. That distinction matters because survivable still means loss. It still means men going over the side into freezing water. It still means escorts circling oil slicks and debris, knowing that stopping would only add more wreckage to the same coordinates. It still means letters that never arrive and families who learn to read silence as news. For Germany, the shift is quieter but more final. U-boat crews continue to sail, but they sail into an ocean that no longer belongs to them. Detection comes faster. Attacks are interrupted. Escorts coordinate across distances that once protected submarines. Aircraft appear overhead where none should be. The sea that once offered invisibility now feels crowded with enemies who never show themselves. Losses become routine. Entire patrols fail to return. Bases receive fewer boats than expected. Training shortens. Experience thins. The mathematics that once favored attrition begin to work in reverse. Every submarine lost now costs more than it can possibly earn back. And still, orders continue. Because stopping would mean admitting that the strategy has failed. And in a war built on pressure and time, admitting failure carries its own consequences. So the boats keep sailing, even as survival rates drop, even as the ocean grows less forgiving by the month. By late 1944, the outcome is no longer in doubt. The Atlantic is no longer a question mark. It is a corridor. Supplies move in volumes Germany cannot disrupt. American industry pours across the ocean in steel, fuel, vehicles, and men. What was once a fragile lifeline becomes a constant flood. The land war reflects that change immediately. Armies move faster, airfields multiply, advances accelerate, retreats turn permanent. Every mile gained on land is backed by a sea that no longer threatens to pull everything back into darkness. And yet, for the sailors still crossing the Atlantic, nothing feels resolved. They still sail at night, without lights. They still drill for abandoned ship. They still listen for alarms that may never come, or may come too late. Because the Atlantic does not care about outcomes. It does not acknowledge victory. It does not respect conclusions. It only reacts to motion. As long as ships move, it takes its share. And the war demands that they keep moving. By the final year of the war, the Atlantic has become something close to routine, and that is its most deceptive phase. Convoys move in numbers that would have been unthinkable in 1940. Escort screens are layered, coordinated, relentless. Air cover stretches almost continuously across routes that were once blind corridors of death. On paper, the battle is won. At sea, it never feels that way. Men still die in the same water. Ships still break apart the same way. Storms still scatter formations and turn discipline into chaos. A mine does not care that the balance has shifted. A torpedo does not care that the war is almost over. The Atlantic continues to take lives at the same speed it always has, quietly, impersonally, without warning. That continuity hides the scale of what has changed, because what the Allies have secured by this point is not safety, but certainty. The certainty that losses, however painful, can no longer decide the war. The certainty that ships will arrive faster than they can be sunk. The certainty that starvation will not do what bombs and armies could not. That certainty is everything. It allows planners to think months ahead instead of days. It allows invasions to be supplied without gambling on weather and luck alone. It allows Europe to be treated as a battlefield again, not a besieged island clinging to survival. The Atlantic makes that possible, not by winning cleanly, but by refusing to break. When Germany finally collapses in 1945, the ocean does not change. There is no visible difference between the Atlantic of April and the Atlantic of May. The waves look the same. The routes look the same. Ships still sail, only the pressure is gone. And even that fades slowly. Wrecks continue to be found years later. Oil still surfaces from hulls torn open long after the war ended. Mines drift. Bodies never return. The seabed holds the cost of keeping Europe alive, spread across thousands of miles where no memorials stand. That is why the Battle of the Atlantic resists simple storytelling. It has no single hero, no decisive charge, no final blow. It is a war fought by repetition, by endurance, by men doing the same dangerous work again and again, knowing that nothing they do will ever feel decisive, and that if they stop, everything collapses. The Atlantic is not remembered because it was dramatic. It is remembered because it was necessary. Because without it, nothing else that followed would have mattered. And that necessity never becomes comfortable. Even as victory approaches, the routines forged in danger do not relax. Convoy schedules remain rigid, escorts remain alert, drills continue as if nothing has changed. Because everyone involved understands something that never needs to be said out loud. The Atlantic does not reward optimism. It punishes complacency. Men who have crossed the ocean dozens of times still feel the same tightening in the chest when the horizon disappears at night. They still measure distance in hours of exposure. They still listen to the water as if it might speak back. Habit replaces hope because hope invites disappointment. On land, the war is becoming legible. Front lines move, cities fall, flags change. Progress can be pointed to on a map. At sea, progress remains abstract. It is felt only in the absence of catastrophe, in convoys that arrive without incident, in months where losses remain below the line that signals danger. That line is always there. The Atlantic never lets anyone forget how thin it is. For Britain, this memory persists long after the last shots are fired. The island remembers how close it came to being cut off from the world, how survival depended not on a single battle, but on a continuous flow that could not be interrupted, even briefly. That understanding reshapes policy, planning, and perception in ways that outlast the war itself. For the United States, the Atlantic becomes proof of something newly learned. That industrial power means little without secure movement. That oceans are not buffers, but battlefields. That distance does not guarantee safety. Only time, coordination, and relentless effort do. For Germany, the Atlantic becomes a lesson written too late. The realization that attrition cuts both ways. That sinking ships matters only if the enemy cannot replace them faster than you can destroy them. That a strategy built on pressure collapses once the pressure is absorbed instead of amplified. These conclusions are never announced. They settle slowly, the way tides do, shaping thinking without drawing attention to themselves. The men who lived the Battle of the Atlantic rarely speak of it afterward in dramatic terms. There are no stories of last stands or decisive moments. There are stories of cold, of waiting, of alarms in the dark, of ships that were there one moment and gone the next, of oceans that felt endless until they suddenly didn't. And perhaps that is the most accurate way to remember it, not as a clash of fleets, but as a test of whether a society could sustain itself under constant, invisible pressure, day after day, year after year, without breaking. The Atlantic applied that pressure relentlessly, and in the end, it did not break the side that needed it most. By the time the war ends, the Atlantic has already faded from attention. Victory is explained through landings, breakthroughs, and flags raised over ruined cities. The sea slips back into the background where it spent most of the war, present, essential, and largely ignored. That is not an accident. The Atlantic was never meant to be noticed. Its value was measured in continuity, not spectacle. And continuity is easy to overlook once it becomes normal. Ships keep arriving, ports keep working, factories keep running. The emergency that once defined every decision quietly dissolves into routine. Only afterward does it become clear how artificial that sense of normality was, how much effort it took to keep the flow alive, how close it came to stopping. The men who fought the Atlantic return home without parades. Merchant sailors receive little recognition compared to soldiers and airmen. Escort crews are scattered back into peacetime navies or civilian life. Their war leaves no clear line to commemorate, no single date to remember. It exists as a blur of crossings and losses that never quite crystallize into a single story. But the outcome is unmistakable. Europe is not liberated because armies are brave enough to land. Armies land because ships arrive often enough to sustain them. Cities are rebuilt because materials can cross oceans safely. Alliances endure because distance stops being a barrier to support. The Atlantic makes all of that possible. It does so not by dramatic victory, but by refusing to fail. That refusal costs lives every day it lasts. It demands attention without offering reward. It punishes mistakes instantly and often invisibly. It asks men to accept that their success will never be obvious. and that their failure will be absolute. This is why the Battle of the Atlantic resists myth. It does not fit into stories of bold maneuvers or decisive moments. It is a war defined by repetition, attrition, and endurance, by people doing the same dangerous work again and again because stopping is not an option. And that is precisely why it matters. Because if the Atlantic had been lost, nothing else could have been won. No campaigns, no offensives, no liberation. The war would have ended quietly, not with surrender, but with exhaustion and hunger spreading inward from the coasts. That never happens. Not because the ocean becomes friendly, not because the danger disappears, but because, convoy by convoy, crossing by crossing, the flow holds. And in holding, it decides the fate of Europe without ever asking to be remembered. What remains once the noise of victory fades is the scale of what almost happened. It is easy to forget how close the margins were because the Atlantic does not leave scars on maps. But during the worst years of the war, Britain's survival is measured not in strategy or morale, but in weeks. Weeks of food, weeks of fuel, weeks of shipping capacity before the system tips from strain into collapse. There are moments when that collapse feels possible. Not dramatic, not sudden, just a slow tightening. Rations reduced again, imports delayed again, convoys rerouted again, each adjustment rational on its own. Together they sketch the outline of a future no one wants to name. This is the future Germany is trying to create. Not a conquered Britain, but an isolated one. An island forced to choose between feeding its people and fighting a war. An enemy that defeats itself because the ocean has been turned against it. No invasion required, no occupation needed, just patience. And for a time, that patience seems justified. The Allies do not win the Atlantic because they are smarter from the start. They win because they absorb losses without breaking the system that produces replacements. They lose ships faster than anyone wants to admit. But they build faster than Germany can destroy. They lose men in numbers that never make headlines, but they keep sending more. The war becomes asymmetric in a way submarines cannot solve. A U-boat sinks a ship, a shipyard launches 3 more. That math takes time to assert itself, and time in the Atlantic is bought with lives. Every improvement arrives late. Every advantage is paid for in blood before it becomes effective. Radar works better after crews learn how to use it under pressure. Air cover expands after ships have already been lost in the gap. Codes are broken after the enemy has already exploited them. Progress never feels like progress at sea. It feels like damage control. This is why, even when the balance turns, there is no celebration. There is only relief, cautious, temporary, always conditional. The ocean has taught everyone involved that conditions can change quickly and that confidence is dangerous. So the convoys keep sailing as if nothing has been decided, because nothing ever is. Not until the war on land is clearly unwinnable for Germany. Not until armies are pushing toward Berlin. Not until the Atlantic's role becomes background rather than lifeline. Only then does the scale of what it prevented become visible in hindsight. And by then, the men who made it possible are already gone, dispersed, silent, absorbed back into a world that never saw the war they fought. The Atlantic does not ask to be remembered, it only demands to be crossed. When the war finally ends, there is no moment when the Atlantic is declared safe. No signal is sent. No last convoy marks the victory. No officer stands on a deck and announces that the invisible war is over. The ships simply keep sailing. That is how the Battle of the Atlantic ends, not with triumph, but with continuity, with routes that remain open, with ports that stay full, with an ocean that no longer threatens to decide the war by default, and only then does the scale of it become clear. For nearly 6 years, Europe's fate rested on whether steel hulls could keep crossing cold water faster than they could be sent to the bottom, whether men could keep showing up for watches knowing that nothing they did would ever feel decisive, whether a society could endure losses that were never fully seen, never fully counted, never fully acknowledged. The Atlantic tested that endurance every day. It tested it in storms that tore convoys apart, in nights where alarms came too late, in decisions where stopping to save lives meant risking hundreds more. There was no glory in those choices, only necessity. Had the Atlantic been lost, the war would not have ended with surrender ceremonies or ruined capitals. It would have ended quietly, factories slowing, cities dimming, armies running out of fuel and food, an island starved into submission without a single decisive blow. That future was closer than history likes to admit. It did not happen because the flow held, because ships kept coming, because escorts kept circling, because sailors, merchant and naval, accepted a war where success meant nothing happened and failure meant everything ended. The Battle of the Atlantic did not produce heroes in the way people recognize easily. It produced survivors. It produced time. It produced the conditions under which every other victory became possible. Normandy happens because the Atlantic holds. Liberation happens because the Atlantic holds. Europe survives because the Atlantic holds. And when the war is remembered, attention turns to beaches, cities, and flags, to moments that can be photographed and named. The Atlantic is rarely one of them, but without that invisible war, there would have been nothing left to remember. Just water.